Hello again, it's Bill Doggett, an African-American performing arts historian and early sound archivist with a very special collection of early sound recordings that all document the excellence and existence of African-American performing arts in early sound. We're returning to the Black Swan label and to the Negro Spiritual, Joshua Fit, the Battle of Jerricho, in one of its earliest recordings. It's recorded here by the Harrod's Jubilee Singers. Harrod Jubilee Singers were considered in its time to be an ensemble that was the successor of the original Fisk Jubilee Singers. They also, like the Fisk Jubilee Singers, toured in Europe and in 1914 had an extraordinary world tour. They were very prominent in the United States in the late teens through the 20s. They also, interestingly enough, are the intermediary ensemble. If we look at the beginning as the Fisk Jubilee Singers, then come the Harrod Jubilee Singers, and next come by 1929-30 another ensemble, which essentially the Harrod Jubilee Singers passes the torch to in terms of the performance and the excellence and the showcasing of the Negro Spiritual, and that is to Hall Johnson and the Hall Johnson Negro Choir. I'd like to talk about the many levels of contextualization of Joshua Fit, the Battle of Jerricho. Of course, it's an iconic Negro spiritual, but it's more than that. If we look at the history of the Black Church, especially during the Great Migration, which is 1914-18, and going into the 20s and the early 30s, this was also known as an ode hymn. This is an ode hymn that my grandmother, who was originally from Richmond, Virginia, and migrated in the Great Migration to North Philadelphia, talked about. This is also an ode hymn that my mother talked about hearing in my grandmother's church, which was first African at 16th and Christian in North Philadelphia. It is an ode hymn that they sang. It is also at my father's mother's church in North Philadelphia, Wanola Doggett's church, where she was the church pianist for decades, that church being Haven Methodist, a very prominent church of its era. This was also an ode hymn, if you will, that was performed and well-liked. Unfortunately, in the churches of our current day, Joshua Fit, the Battle of Jerricho is not performed as an ode hymn or is not as well known, especially into the new generation of our era and our time. So it's very significant to look back at the history of the spiritual and the importance of it. One final note, and a very important piece of contextualization, is that Archie Harrod, who was a tenor, who founded the Harrod Jubilee Singers, did something very historic. All of the Jubilee Singer quartets, or larger, even the larger, or let's say smaller ensembles of maybe 10 to 12, mostly featured men. This recording from July of 1922 features a woman. Of course, he had an integrated ensemble of men and women, but in the recording, which could have and often features a male's voice, the male lead, in this one it features the female lead, a woman's voice. And it is no surprise that also this represents the time of the suffrage movement. So it's an interesting confluence and certainly an important contextualization to give. Let's take a listen.
Jerricho and the Washington.